So I'll say good afternoon or good evening, everybody. It's very good to see you here and very good to see so many people online as well. So I'm Helen Fulton, the PI on the MOLIC project, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today for one of our regular seminars. Andy Seaman is reader in early medieval archaeology at Cardiff University. He specialises in the archaeology of late antique and early medieval Britain, with a focus on Wales and southwest England. Andy's published very widely, particularly on hill forts, and he's done field work at the hill fort at Dinas Powys and also at Mount St Albans near Caerleon. Andy's currently PI on a Leverhulme project called Making the March, Contesting Lands in the Early Medieval Frontier, and his paper today is related to that project. So his title is A Hippo in the March, an early medieval centre on the Breiddin Hill and its context in a frontier landscape. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to speak. So what I thought I'd do in this lecture is just first of all give a sort of introduction to what the project is and what it's about and how we're doing it. And then to explore one of the sort of key case study sites, which is a place called New Pieces, or a site called New Pieces, which sits on the Breiddin Hill, and which I hope might be of some interest to this audience, because there is a sort of interesting intersection with some of the literary evidence for this site. As well. So Making the March. This is a 3-year Leverhulme-funded project, and it's very much a collaborative piece of work between myself and Charles Inslee at Manchester, the PI, the co-I. We also have Keith Ray as the Senior Research Fellow, then Marion Shiner, Ewan McCarthy, PhD student, and our newest member, Dr Richard Purkis, who is the history PDRA. And in a nutshell, the project is about the origins and evolution and sort of articulation of the early medieval frontier in the Welsh March. How did the frontier, when and how did the frontier emerge, and how was this space contested in the early medieval period? So it's a sort of prehistory of the later medieval March, and we're doing this principally because this is a topic which has evaded much scrutiny in the past. Such archaeological work as there has been very much focused on mapping and attempting to date various bits of the great linear earthworks which we think about when we think of the early medieval March, being Offa's and Wat's Dyke. And beyond that, archaeological investigation has been fairly limited. There's also been comparatively little sort of integrated study of the pre-Norman sources, such as they are, and for the most part, archaeologists, historians, place name specialists, and historical geographers haven't really been in dialogue with one another in their research on the early medieval March. And one of the other problems, or one of the other reasons that we're sort of doing this work is how do we explore archaeologically a frontier which is 200 kilometers long and 50, 60 kilometers wide. This is a vast area which doesn't really lend itself to traditional techniques of archaeological investigation. So our aim with the Making the March project, our aims, I should say, are to undertake a interdisciplinary, multi-scalar, cross-border analysis of the creation and development and articulation of the frontier but not to treat it in isolation, but to contextualize what we find through a sort of European lens. And hopefully along the way, provide a sort of platform for further research, something which other people can take on board. And our approach, as we framed it, is quite interdisciplinary. I can never articulate that word very well. So we have historians and archaeologists on the team, and a wider sort of body of specialists within the sort of project board as well. And as I'll explore in a minute, our approach is very much framed around this concept, which we call critical locality, which is the lens we use to explore these landscapes. And essentially what I'm doing, what the sort of archaeological element of the project is targeted archaeological investigation of features which might help us to understand how this landscape came into being and was being contested. And as part of this, we're writing up some excavations which were undertaken on the one dot on the map, apart from the dikes, the one site that we sort of knew about, which is this site called New Pieces, which has been subject to some excavation, but which for one reason or another was not written up. So that's one thing we've taken on board. We also have a PhD student who's looking at assembly landscapes of meeting and gathering places, as a sort of part of a 3-year PhD within the overarching project. And at all times, we're really trying to situate what we're doing within wider European frameworks for comparison. So, as I said, critical locality. This is the sort of concept which we are using as a kind of a lens or a kind of keyhole to try to unlock the articulation of this frontier landscape. And as we've got 5 study areas going up the march, broadly kind of on the corridor of the dikes. Chetstow, the lower Y, then the just to the west of Hereford, then up to the Clun Valley, then the upper Severn Valley, and then up to the Allen Valley around Mold. These are our sort of study areas, and these have been chosen because they are, in a variety of different ways, conduits through the frontier space. These are places where the topography and the environment sort of have a sort of, they are natural thoroughfares through, or conduits through, the frontier space. So they're often river valleys or the confluence or interfluvial areas. And we've chosen these because they are places where we can reasonably assume that the frontier space was being contested. There is a centrality to them. And within these places, we are looking for what we define as critical localities. These are places that would have had a strategic importance in the frontier landscape and which may have been contested. So these were places such as observation points, so for surveillance, places to interrupt and control movement, so gating points, bridging points, places for accommodation of military and administrative infrastructure, roads, fortifications, mustering points, lookout posts, meeting places, beacons, etc., etc. So we're focusing on these sort of landscapes where we think communities or people are moving through the frontier, and then within those spaces, trying to identify the critical localities where we might be able to gather some data about the nature of these sites, their date, and what's going on, etc. And that work is very much ongoing. We have a sort of multi-phase approach where there's a lot of desk-based survey, then walkover archaeological survey, and then in the coming months we'll be starting intrusive archaeological works as well, to try to sort of improve our understanding. But whereas we went into the project, one of the sites we knew we wanted to look at was new pieces. That's not a particularly exciting name. It's not an ancient name. It's just a name derived from the Ordnance Survey map. It refers to newly enclosed land. It's just a convenient short term. But this is one of the few known early medieval sites within the March. Moreover, it's one where we have pretty good evidence for activity of some significant status and importance, and which appears to form part of a cluster of sites in this very sort of off the Severn area. But it's also quite an intriguing site. It has an unusual location, which poses quite a lot of questions. And there was also quite a nice opportunity here, because whilst we knew enough about it from the 1 or 2 paragraphs which had been published, that it's a significant site, but the work hadn't been written up, and the excavator having left archaeology, so there was an opportunity to deal with a kind of legacy excavation and deliver on our objectives and aims for this project. So looking a little bit closer, we're in Northern March on the Breiddin Hills, just to the west, just to the east of Welsh Pool. And for those of you who know the March, you'll know the Breiddin as you drive up past Welsh Pool. They appear very dramatically on the skyline. And really mark the sort of, there's Lena, they mark the kind of northern or the southern end of a sort of lowland, a series of valleys that run into Upland Wales, into Powys. And we have the Severn, the River Severn, going around the top of the Breiddin, which at this point is navigable from the sea at the right time of the year. So on the Breiddin Hill itself, which most people know because of Rodney's Pillar, very impressive, I think it's 18th century landmark. But wrapping around that on the highest ground is a very impressive, very monumental, now largely quarried away, unfortunately, Iron Age hill fort, known in the archaeological literature as the Breiddin Hill Fort. And a little way to the south of it is what's known as Camp 2, or settlement. So you can see why we've called it New Pieces, because Camp 2 isn't as an exciting name. A fairly innocuous and small enclosure, which doesn't look to be particularly exciting on first inspection. And this is what it looks like on the ground. So we've got a LiDAR survey here, which is a 3D laser scan of the site and an interpretive plot of it here. Unfortunately, the site was under plantation for 30-40 years, which has done some damage, particularly in the southwest here, where the earthworks are largely have largely been removed. But it's a small, about sort of 50 by 70 meter complex of earthworks, of at least 2 phases. A small square inner enclosure, which appears to be the early phase, this one here, and then a larger egg-shaped outer enclosure, which, as you can see here, runs over the inner enclosure, which It must be later in date. And at the top, there's this curious sort of platform type feature, an artificial flat terrace. Is there something wrong with this?
The screen's being shared. I think she just means when you point at the screen.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
Though you are sharing the screen.
Okay. Okay. So, and it's a curious location, 300 meters OD. So very high up, facing southwest into the prevailing wind, on a slope, on a hill slope, just below a kind of knoll of the hill. It's sort of hanging off of a spur. Here, with these two enclosures with the kind of platform at the top there. And the site first drew archaeological attention in the 1930s when B.H. St John O'Neill, as part of his excavations on the adjacent hill fort, undertook fairly small-scale trial trenching of this Camp 2 site, undertaken not by himself but by workmen. So this is in the early days of archaeological investigation. And he only did a sort of small amount of work, but retrieved an interesting assemblage of material. He got some Romano-British pottery, what he thought was some Romano-British glass, and some metalworking evidence, and intriguingly, 2 iron styli, so writing implements for writing on wax tablets, which is quite curious because we are very, very high up in the Welsh hills here. And this work was done in the 30s, written up in the 1930s, and New Pieces was, on this basis, considered to be a fairly unusual, because of its location, but not particularly exciting Romano-British settlement. And that was the case until the early 1980s, when, as part of a re-evaluation of the evidence for early medieval settlement in Wales, my colleagues Alan Lane and Nancy Edwards sort of undertook a review of the evidence for early medieval settlement, and it was tentatively suggested that the glass vessels that O'Neill had, or the fragments of glass that O'Neill had recovered from his excavations on New Pieces, were not Roman, but were in fact early medieval or post-Roman, and belonged to a tradition of very high status, quite rare imported glass vessels. That would make the site of some quite significant status. Ewan Campbell was very much part of this work. He was doing a PhD at the time, exploring and reviewing this material. So in 1988, it was sort of suggested that New Pieces was a possible early medieval settlement. And I should say, I probably don't need to say to this audience that any early medieval evidence from Wales is rare. It is vanishingly rare, and even more vanishingly rare in the March, where these sites just aren't encountered. So at some point in the 90s, there was then another campaign of excavation. This was led by the late Chris Arnold, supported by Jeremy Huggett. I'm not entirely certain why the site was chosen, but I think Chris and Jeremy had an interest in the early medieval period. They were aware of the work that had been done in the late 80s, suggesting that there was some significant early medieval activity here. So a new campaign of excavation was initiated, running from 96 to 2000. It was run as a sort of field school, and their aim was to basically re-excavate O'Neill's trench and then expand it somewhat to sort of contextualize what O'Neill had, what O'Neill's workmen had recovered. So the area in yellow is the sort of the extensions of O'Neill's trench, and then the area in green is the main bit of O'Neill's trench, which was then re-excavated. And the area in red here is the area which was excavated anew by Arnold and Huggett and their team. And you can see in this lower photograph here, this is O'Neill's trench being emptied out with the intact archaeological deposits either side of it. So this work was undertaken, but for one reason or another was not written up. Chris Arnold left archaeology in shortly after the completion of the excavation, and despite very, very significant things that were found, the archive has sort of pretty much languished ever since. So one of the aims of this project was to take on that archive, write it up as part of this wider project. And I think it's fair to say that what Arnold and Huggett discovered is of undoubted national or international significance. It is a very, very interesting site with a very important assemblage of material, which is contributing very significantly to our understanding of this landscape in the early medieval period. This is an ongoing piece of research. It takes to write up somebody else's excavations is quite tricky. It takes quite a lot of work. You have to think your way into what they were thinking, sort of decode their sort of some of their interpretations and piece everything together. And this work is still very much ongoing. We are working our way through interpreting this mass of kind of structural evidence that's still going. But we have got a very good handle on the artifactual evidence and the dating, and that's what I'll be predominantly talking about today. But certainly we know enough from what we've done so far, or I should say what Marion China has done. Marion is really the person who has been driving on this part of the project. Is we have a series of features which are cut into and in turn cut by a artificial terrace, which has sort of been cut into the hill slope. So this line here is a terrace which has been cut across the green area here to create a level platform, and then that platform has features cut into it, and some of them I think actually do predate the cutting of that terrace. It's too early to say what we have with complete certainty, but there is fairly good evidence for structures, perhaps 2 or more structures defined by gullies with stakes, double lines of stakes within them. We also have potential post hole structures. We have halves, some of which may be domestic, but other halves look as if they're associated with metalworking evidence. We may also have corn drying kilns and things associated with the processing of crops. So it's a busy site. Very rarely do we have a site from early medieval Wales which produces such a variety of such an amount of structural evidence. But looking at the material culture, there's quite a lot of interesting things going on, and that's what I'll focus on now. We have a small quantity of prehistory. Not get away from it, unfortunately. There's always a bit of prehistory. So we have some flint, some late Neolithic, early Bronze Age flint, a little bit of late Bronze Age pottery, but not very significant quantities of it. We certainly do have some Romano-British material, including pottery, 1st to 4th century, some fine wares, so some bits of Samian ware. We have some genuine Roman glass vessels, We have some beads, some Romano British beads. We have a very, very interesting copper alloy animal figurine, which is probably late Roman in date, but we'll look at that in more detail later on. But the thing to say about the Romano British material is none of it, as far as we can tell, is what we would say in situ, meaning none of it is from Roman period deposits. It all appears to be in redeposited contexts. And we don't actually know which, if any, of the features illustrated here are Romano British in date. In fact, we have early medieval material from the stratigraphically earliest features, pretty much. So whilst there is Romano British activity here, we're not really in a position to be able to say what it looks like. But let's focus on the early medieval material now. And this is really quite unusual and exciting. And here I must acknowledge the really important work of Dr. Ewan Campbell from the University of Glasgow, one of Jeremy Huggett's colleagues. Ewan produced a report in 2001 on some of this material and has been looking with us at it since. And what we have are a number of categories of very rare, quite unusual, imported early medieval material. This includes Phrygian red slipware, which has been imported from the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is found largely just in the southwest of England and South Wales. It's most famously known from sites such as Tintagel, and is generally not found more than 5 kilometres from the coast, let alone 300 metres up on the side of a hill in mid-Wales. We also have pottery known as D-ware or DSPA. This was manufactured in Western France, probably somewhere around Bordeaux or the Loire, 6th century in date. Again, very rare, not found on very many sites, never previously found in the March. We also have, as we knew from the late 80s, glass vessels, but a very significant quantity of them, at least 10, probably more like 12. And to put that in context, one vessel is really exciting. And we have fragments of 10 or 11. These are of Campbell's type C and D, so the cone beakers, we think manufactured in Western France, probably contemporary with the D-ware and potentially the red slipwares. And then something which we found in a bag last summer is an even rarer object, which is a fragment of Campbell's type A glass, which is engraved glass, spectacularly fine, very clear. It is engraved, and we can see the shape of a feather which has been engraved into it. This has come probably from the Mediterranean. Could have been produced in the 4th century or 5th, but where we do find it in Britain, it's usually associated with the post-Roman imports. So this is an unusual assemblage. It is an extremely high status assemblage. And as you can see from this map, generally these sites are on the sort of Atlantic seaboard, close to the coast, and they're here circled. I'll talk about the other dot in a moment. We are the exceptions to that rule. And this is what it looks like. This is PRS. This is the famous Dinas Paris example with the bunnies on it. This is a reconstruction of a cone beaker, the white trail decoration, and this is a D-ware plate. And this material culture is all to do with eating and drinking. Late antique dining practices, communal dining practices. This is drinking and feasting equipment. The D-ware is designed to look like silver plate, the sort of things which you find in Sutton Hoo Mound 1. And the fun thing about a cone beaker is if you're drinking from it, you can't put it down unless it's empty. And this assemblage from a comparatively small trench, dug without sort of sieving or particular high recovery rate, has produced the third largest assemblage from Wales. It is second only in size the assemblage to Dinas Powys and Longbury Bank, which are two sites of sort of international significance. And as Ewan has commented here, this is quite remarkable for a site which is so far inland and attests to a very high status activity taking place here. But it's not just a pottery that's of interest. Here we have, and apologies for the poor photograph, this is very much work in progress. And literally we are opening the boxes to see what's there. This is a little copper alloy clip, which has some wood still in situ. And you could be forgiven for not knowing what this is instantly, but this is a rim clip from a bucket or stave-built bucket, best known from Anglo-Saxon contexts. Often it's yew, the wood, and we'll be sending this off. These are found in very high status Anglo-Saxon contexts as part of furnished burials. Again, we think associated with drinking. It's part of drinking equipment, drinking culture. Other material objects, a whole box of iron. And when I first looked at the iron, I thought that can't be early medieval. There's far too much of it because we don't ever get very much. But no, there is no post-medieval on the site. There's no late medieval. Everything is coming from early medieval deposits. And we have some very nice objects, including, I think, some bits of bridle gear for horses. We've got a copper alloy buckle and fitting, a huge amount of metalworking evidence. Now this is being looked at by Tim Young at the moment, but potentially associated with the processing of iron blooms. So not the smithing, but the sort of secondary process, the working those blooms into ingots, which again isn't actually evidenced very well in this period and not seen on a large number of sites. There's some other curious things. A fragment of obsidian, which must have come from the Mediterranean. Don't entirely know what that's doing there. We have potentially handmade pottery, which is very curious for a number of reasons. And well, we do have handmade pottery, but its closest parallels are to Anglo-Saxon traditions of pottery manufacture. And that's unusual because there is no native tradition of pottery manufacture at this period in this part of Britain. So that's something that requires exploration. And of course, the style from O'Neill's excavation in the 30s. I'll come back to style in a moment. And then we have this, which I opened up the box, and Ewan Campbell actually happened to be with me. And looking back at me is this beautiful little copper alloy figurine, which can only be a hippopotamus. We have tried to turn it into a sheep or a dog or a cow or many other types of animal, but the one everybody keeps coming back to is a hippo. This is found in an early medieval deposit. It's associated with the imported glass and some of the Mediterranean material. It's just under 2 centimeters long. It has a setting on its top, possibly for a stone or for enamel or something like that. It has a little fitting under its front legs to sit into something, and then its backside has been cut or filed to receive something, as if it's sitting against something. And this is without parallel. Well, largely without parallel in a British context. It's been very difficult to work out what this is and to date it. So how did a hippopotamus get 300 meters up on the side of the Breiddin Hill? Did it swim up the River Severn from the sea, getting lost? It is a most curious thing. But if you look hard enough in the archaeological literature, we can find parallels. We do find figurines, hippo figurines, particularly during the Romano-British period in the early 2nd century, when there is a sort of period of Egyptomania under Hadrian, where Egyptian mythology and Egyptian gods sort of get, as they are now, get kind of reused and recycled. And we have a little bit of material culture relating to that. So here we have a kind of motley collection of hippos that I've been able to find, all not dissimilar to my one. And I've got this one here, which has the snake on the back. So I do wonder whether, you know, we had a fitting or something like that on the back of it. What sort of object it came from? I really, some of these have got suspension loops, so they have been suspended as part of a necklace or something like that. Other ones are pierced. So again, but our one appears to be, sits within a kind of larger composite object. Potentially something like that. These are Romano-British folding knives, copper alloy folding knives, so iron knife blade, folding knife handle. This is the sort of size and the sort of fitting which this beastie, beautiful beastie, may have come from. It's highly unusual, and just adds, I think, another sort of curiosity to this site. I think we can be fairly certain it must have come, well, it's come from, you know, it's been inspired by African examples. It must have arrived in Britain probably from the Mediterranean. Whether it arrived in the Romano-British period, because we do have some Romano-British material, or whether it arrived alongside the early medieval imports as an antique, as an ancient object by that period. The red slipware is coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. We've got the obsidian as well. We've got that glass. This could be a sort of an assemblage which is being exported, but it really is a very remarkable object. So what do we have when we look at this site? We've got evidence for international trade and exchange. We have evidence for feasting, drinking, prestigious material, metalworking. We have a literate community, record keeping, at a time from which records are vanishingly rare. For a variety of reasons, I think we may have a site associated with hunting as well, given its particular location. And if we turn to the archaeological literature, the parallels are a group of sites which can broadly, very broadly, be sort of characterized as under the umbrella of hill forts. And by which I don't mean the sort of traditional, this is a term I'll sort of borrow from Leslie Alcock, really, to refer to defended or at least very impressively cited high status places. I'm thinking along the lines of now Dinas Powys in Glamorgan, Tintagel on the north coast of Cornwall, Dinas Emrys in Gwynedd, Cadbury Congresbury in Somerset, potentially South Cadbury also in Somerset, High Peak in Devon. This is the sort of material culture assemblage we're dealing with, but the richness places it amongst the kind of highest strata of those. This is a place where a wealthy high status activity is taking place. How we interpret them is a matter of debate and something which I've been working on for a number of years now. Some of these sites do appear to be sort of elite residences. The court, the llys of a ruler, as Leslie Alcock would put it. Dinas Powys will probably fall within that category, but others appear to be more ceremonial in nature, or perhaps associated with periodic gathering at times of assembly. But they are certainly associated with an emergent British elite. These types of sites, this range of material culture is restricted to the west of Britain and largely to the coasts or sort of some navigable rivers. And one of the interesting things about these sites is they appear to be almost wholesale abandoned in the 7th century. So another piece of work we've been doing is trying to get a chronology for these places. And for the most part, the radiocarbon dates very much drop off around the 640s, 650s. And this is a contrast to Scotland, where these sorts of places continue into the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And often these places do not sit on their own. They form clusters of sites. What John Blair has recently described as polyfocal clusters, polyfocal central clusters. And I always use, a nice example would be somewhere like Glastonbury here, where we know we've got post-Roman activity on the Tor, at the Abbey site, at the Mound site, at Beckery Chapel. And then there's this sort of curious earthwork that may define the whole lot. And there are hints that we might have something similar up on the Breiddin here. There might be some post-Roman activity on the main hill fort. There looks to be a holy well just below it, a white well. We've got new pieces here. We've got this little enclosure here that I found last week, previously unexplored, and then there's another hill fort on Middleton Hill as well. So we might be looking at a sort of complex of elite activity taking place high up on the Breiddin. And there's another dot on the map for the import wares, and that's Much Wentlock Priory, where there is a single fragment of Campbell's type C glass, imported glass, recovered, redeposited. Now, this is, I probably shouldn't say, but that is significant. It's a single sherd, but it got there. And we know Much Wentlock is quite interesting because of the place name, which implies a pre-Anglo-Saxon. It's long been hypothesized as a pre-English church. And there is, I think, that really is, it's okay, it's not a smoking gun, but it's pretty close. And we might want to think of new pieces and Much Wentlock as very, very dimly, hazily glimpsed evidence for some sort of Brythonic, British, pre-English polity in the West Midlands. Perhaps this, I wouldn't want to give it a name. I wouldn't want to call it Powys or anything like that. But perhaps the sort of entity that later medieval Powys was looking back towards as a sort of into the pre-Dyke period. But there's some peculiarities about new pieces. It has an unusual setting. It is the highest early medieval settlement in Wales, yet it's really, really high up, but it's not in a particularly impressive or commanding position. Neither is it sheltered from the prevailing winds. It seems to be deliberately sited away from the highest ground, but not in a necessarily particularly habitable spot. It's the furthest inland of any site with imported pottery and glass. And what's particularly intriguing is that all of the material we have comes from this inner enclosure, the light grey one, the bank 1 enclosure here, which on stratigraphic terms appears to be the earliest. So there might be a later phase. Is that later phase perhaps associated with that handmade Anglo-Saxon pottery? That's a potential. If so, the site is going on into the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries potentially. This is something we hope to resolve through radiocarbon dating. We haven't yet got those dates back. And then also we have this odd platform, this leveled platform, which has been sort of deliberately incorporated into one of this outer, potentially later enclosure. So it's a very intriguing place at which people are doing interesting and important things in this very poorly understood period. Let's zoom out a little further and now look at the site in its sort of slightly wider landscape context. As I said, it sits on the Breiddin Hill, but it has quite an interesting relationship to the dike. The Breiddin Hills sit in front of a gap in Offa's Dyke, between Buttington Cross and just south of Four Crosses there. So there is, as far as we can tell, there is no dike in that area. And this is a sort of zone of the landscape which is bisected by the navigable Severn. We've also got the Roman road from Wroxeter to Ford and Gaia. And you can see on this illustration the valleys heading up into Powys. You can sort of see the natural routeways going in. We've got the head of navigation at Poole Quay on the Severn there. There's a interesting but fairly poorly understood lowland enclosure, Ardleen, a lowland defended enclosure with a little bit of scrappy evidence for post-Roman activity. There's a remarkable site of Four Crosses, where we have a tremendously rich archaeological landscape from the Neolithic onwards, with quite a lot of early medieval activity as well, which we would interpret as a very long-lived and quite significant assembly location, which the dike has gone straight through. Deliberately, it has slighted this long-lived place of meeting. And there is a rather curious site here, which is a prehistoric barrow, which may have early medieval spears thrust into it, just framed by the dike. But the dating of those spears is not that definite. But it's still a very curious thing. Then we have Buttington Cross, which I'm sure you will all know from the entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles for a battle site. I've forgotten the date, but it's 9th century. But also at Buttington, we've got some other early medieval evidence, some corn drying kilns, attesting to at least settlement, potentially some sort of, again, might be another sort of assembly place. So New Pieces is kind of situated right in the middle of this very busy landscape, which people are moving through across this frontier space. Zoom out very further and it sort of gets a little bit more kind of strategic potential. Now this is a bit of a dense map, so bear with me. The purple star is New Pieces in the Breiddin. We've got Offa's Dyke there in black. In green, we've got good quality farmland, so land which is particularly suited for arable. In red, we've got the later medieval Powys, and then the topography is grayscale. And there's a few things I think you can note from here. Firstly, good quality land is at a premium in Wales. There's a lot more green there in the March than in Mercia. Secondly, it's the east-west valleys, which are affording quite a lot of good land. And New Pieces is kind of sitting at a bridgehead in that gap in the dike between the navigable Severn and the Roman road, at the kind of head of this, well, one of the largest kind of expanses of comparatively fertile ground. So I think the site is when I first came to it, I thought, why on earth is there a literate community 300 meters off on the side of a hill? But when one zooms out and contextualizes it with its landscape, I think that does become explicable. What they're doing up there, well, we may see it as an elite residence, perhaps within an upland hunting landscape. We know hunting was very important at this period. We know the Breiddin was a forest in the late medieval period, and it's also described as a chase. So it could be one of these sort of elite residences, or a place of periodic gathering, perhaps at the time of the hunt, but which also had a role in sort of monitoring and overseeing this frontier landscape, perhaps extending into the sort of 8th, 9th centuries. And it was sort of reading around this, I came across some interesting references, which might sort of help colour this picture a bit. And I'm not an expert here at all, and I should at this point acknowledge important contributions by my colleague Rebecca Thomas, who is really I've just bugged her in the corridor and she's given me some information, but so this is very sort of early. But as I said at the beginning, the Breiddin Hills are incredibly impressive. Here they are, the Breiddin Hills. You can just see Rodney's column there. They are impressive to look upon and to look from. They have spectacular views into the Severn Plain and beyond. I'm not sure. I think you might be able to see sort of Gwynedd and right up. Yeah, it's really quite impressive. The name Breiddin probably means something like fort at the extremity. That could refer to extremity of the hill, or it could refer perhaps to the sort of, that could be a reference to the frontier. But it also is used, there's other spellings of it which have the meaning plunder. And the Breiddin Hills feature quite prominently in the poetry and pseudo-historical traditions of later medieval Powys. So we have the last king of Powys styled as King of the Breiddin in contemporary poetry. And in that narrative, he is in conflict with the English. In another poem, the same poet refers to keeping watch on the frontier from the Breiddin Hill at night. And then there is also further sort of references to an encounter with the English at this, on the sides of the hill as well. So could we be seeing some reflection here of the importance of the Breiddin in the early medieval period as a location, a place of power, a place perhaps associated with, well, initially as a sort of, yeah, a place of power, perhaps rooted in prehistory, in the Breiddin Hill fort, as a sort of place associated with a ceremonial landscape, but which over time becomes quite contested as the frontier emerges in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. So where next with this? Well, as I said, we're very much in the early stages. We've got to write up the work. That's been already done. Got to do all the analysis, getting a suite of radiocarbon dates. We've got a lot more work to do on the literature, on the place names, on the historical sources, to try to bring those in dialogue with the archaeology. But I think we may well be looking to do some more work up there as well. We know enough to say the site is important, but we don't know a lot of the really crucial aspects of it. We don't know what the Romano-British phase looks like. We don't really know the dating of the earthworks. We don't know what that intriguing platform is for. We haven't recovered evidence for which we can do sort of environmental analysis, etc. So I think we know enough to know it's important, but more work is needed. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.